that it was intended to be a history of the 20th century from the perspective of the Western establishment and from the perspective of the CFR archives. And so that's why Quigley's book stands out. It's not your typical history of Western civilization. It's not your typical, intended to be a history of the 20th century from the history of civilizations or something like that, sort of a mainline historian. It's really a policy book for those in the establishment. And of course, Quigley was a Harvard University graduate, historian, then later at Georgetown University, where he spent the most of his career. And so what he's going to do is essentially put forth the real history from the archives of the Round Table Group, the Milner Group, and so forth, who will later in the book be called the Clivenden set, especially during the time of World War II, who we might just simply refer to as kind of the English-European banking dynasty. And eventually this will include the American banking dynasties, Rockefellers, Schiffs, Warburgs, and others, who, while they may have at times differences amongst themselves, various policies, family rivalries, in the big picture are actually not in opposition, but rather interested in consolidating power for the purpose of restructuring the globe and moving us into the age of transitions and global government. And in fact, Quigley will have an entire chapter where he talks about just that very thing, about the move into the third wave convergence period, which is what the globalists have planned for our era, roughly the past few decades and into the next few decades of the future. And what I think is the most telling about Quigley's book is that it's not a conspiracy book. It's an apologetic of sorts, because really Quigley's interested in saying, I have no aversions to the Western establishment's aims and goals. In fact, I think that it's the best hope for mankind, hence the title Tragedy. That would be, of course, the world wars of the last century, and then Hope, which would be, ultimately speaking, the extension of Western Atlanticist libertarian, even though he's not strictly a libertarian, but the basic ideas of liberal democracy, which need to be seeded in the rest of the globe. Now, of course, Quigley was Bill Clinton's mentor, and if you find the clips on YouTube, you can find Bill Clinton thanking his mentor, Carroll Quigley, for, I guess, sort of tutoring him, handling him, so to speak, at Georgetown. But there's also kind of a bit of mythology that's grown up around the book, which is difficult to ferret out, and so you'll hear all kinds of myths and stories and legends. I don't claim to know which ones are true or not true. I don't know how you could really verify these things. People say, oh, there was once a secret plates that were suppressed, and the book wasn't supposed to be published because it showed too much, and oh, oops, they accidentally printed it. And I don't know that I believe all of that, because it's not like there aren't other books that tell you essentially the same game plan or strategy. Brave New World, right? I mean, if the bankers and the technocratic establishment was really worried about it, they would not have been published, right? But it's not like the establishment was worried about the publication of Brave New World. It was published on purpose by one of its top brains, Aldous Huxley. And it's the same, I would say, with Tragedy and Hope. They're not worried about this getting out, or else it wouldn't be out, right? I mean, it's kind of it's important to understand too, which people don't usually talk about, is that there's also propaganda in Quigley's book, right? It's a defense of the Western establishment. Now, some people will make these arguments, oh, Quigley was secretly trying to get out what he couldn't say, and no, he numerous times in the book defends the Western position in its various expansionist tendencies, colonialism, and so forth. He's at times critical of monetary policy and the hardcore libertarian, I guess you could, perspectives, I guess you could say. And so we might class him in this kind of democratic convergence perspective, as we said, this third wave, which was more popular, I think, in the back in the 60s and 70s when he was writing than it is nowadays. Even though really the Fabian third wave sort of blending of Eastern socialism and communism and Western capitalism is pretty much what's happening. Those terminologies are somewhat dated, right? So figures like Alvin Toffler and so forth all have written and spoken of this phenomenon, this perspective. But as we said, the book is important because it's going to lay out the way that the Western establishment, which has the upper hand, obviously geopolitically, the way that it views geopolitics and why it views geopolitics the way it does and why it does what it does. Now, whether you think that's good or bad will, of course, be determined based on what you think of, what your worldview, right, tells you on how things are, and whether we live in a situation where the world has progressed to be something essentially much greater or more positive than it was decades or centuries ago, or whether you think that it maybe has digressed, or maybe neither one. Maybe the world's just continuing on as it always has, with different power structures vying for power, or maybe power doesn't change hands. Maybe power is always concentrated in central institutions. The irony, of course, will be that this newspeak about democracy that will play such an important role in Quigley's books and in Western propaganda and parlance is quite admittedly a fiction. And I think that's one of the first things that will stand out in Quigley's book, is that the lauding, praise, adulation, and so forth in terms of what democracy is and freedom is that supposedly is represented by the West, and all other powers and forces in the world are, of course, by this sort of via negativa, this negation perspective, conceived of as, or demonized, right? Conceived of as anti-liberty. And we'll see this, of course, in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Cold War especially, and then nowadays in the War on Terror, right? The same refrain of propaganda and psychological warfare has been chanted for over a century now, and ultimately going back, certainly to the French Revolution, the chant of liberty, freedom, democracy, and equality, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. We've seen all of this of Western civilization overturned, upturned, churned over, reorganized under this banner since the time of the French Revolution, and obviously it had precedents as well prior to that, scientific revolution, empiricism, and so forth, under the banner of liberty. And what's so startling about this is really the fact that it's been so successful precisely because it has no real context or fuller sense to give it meaning. It's just bare phraseology. It's sloganeering. At the time of the French Revolution, it was nationalism that was the libertarian movement, right? And over time, through large-scale banker geostrategic planning, nationalism has now become the far-right ideology. Interesting. So what was libertarian, liberal, leftist at the time of the French Revolution, French nationalism, and so forth, has morphed, transmuted, and turned into now liberal global hegemony of the West. And that is the only representation of democracy and humanitarianism and so forth. For a good treatise on this, I would suggest, if you haven't heard it, listen to my interview with Alexander Dugin, Putin's former advisor, on this very topic, right? The liberal American world order. And that's what Quigley is going to treat at length and defend at length the liberal American world order. Now, American here, of course, even strictly speaking, to be honest, is not the American people, right? It's not you and me and our buddies and so forth, and even our friends who went off to fight in foreign wars. That's not what makes up America, although to some degree it does, and especially if you are a soldier, right? You are fighting under the banner of America. Americanism is an ideology, and it's the ideology of classical Western liberalism that derives from the Enlightenment, comes to kind of a fruition in the French Revolution, and is based upon a whole host of philosophical and religious or anti-religious presuppositions that ultimately serve to remove, just like with Darwinism and scientism and so forth, coming out of the same period, remove any kind of metaphysical relations. In the 1700s, it would become replaced with materialism, and naturalism would become the new metaphysical God by which persons might find themselves united. And over several generations and centuries, we now see the flowering of Western, quote, liberty in the erasing of gender, right? Explicitly and perfectly, as Professor Dugan in that talk discusses, right, as the logical consequence of these positions. Well, how did we get here? Well, Quigley's going to tell us that. And so in the beginning of the book, he kind of lays out the strategy and the framework and briefly what gave rise to the success of Western civilization and its population increase. And he discusses things like revolutions in agriculture, revolutions in transportation, industrial revolution, right? All of these things, of course, lead up to, and of course, the philosophy, right? There are, one of the reasons for the success of Western philosophy historically in maintaining a general kind of tradition, I guess you could say, is the philosophy that undergirded it. And then Quigley begins, for example, on page 24, discussing what I just laid out, the various shifts, right, that will give birth to the 20th century. And Quigley lists as those shifts, as I said, many of the ones that I mentioned. Number one, the belief in the innate goodness of man. Number two, secularism. Exactly. Number three, belief in progress. Number four, liberalism. Number five, capitalism. Number six, faith in science. Number seven, democracy. Number eight, nationalism. Exactly. So all of the things that I've been telling you and all the things you've heard me say and write about for many years now, here's Quigley telling you all of that. So I know what I'm talking about, right? I didn't invent my ideas. They're not, speculations. Here's the establishment telling you, right? And so Quigley then goes on to list a lot of the figures who, of course, would play prominently in the birth of these new ideas: De Maistre, Metternich, Jefferson, John Stuart Mill, John Locke, on and on and on. We could list, many of Newton, many of these figures that would be prominent luminaries and lights in the secular sense that would lead to the alteration of the way that Western civilization prior to this, which functioned on, depending on how rough or generically you want to define the term West, was monarchical. You had monarchy and you had the church, right? Throne and altar. And so the 8 points that he lists at that time, 1700s, so forth, constituted liberalism. And this is, of course, where we get the term the classical liberal tradition, right? Thomas Reed, right? John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Jefferson, Franklin, right? The fathers of America, Rousseau, and so on. And many of its predecessors, Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, and the Illuminists, Weishaupt, right? These all would play into Mazzini. Many of the even the Masonic orders and so forth would play into the European shift, as Quigley describes it. And that European shift, of course, is grounded in the notion of away with throne, away with altar. And this is explicitly mentioned in, I forget, one of the Scottish Rite, I think, with the Royal Arch maybe, where you vow or to, stab the bishop's mitre or something, you spit on it or something to that, whatever it is. But it's a vow to destroy throne and altar. For what? Well, for the erecting of the liberal, republican, democratic world order. And it's important to understand that though Quigley doesn't engage in anything really dealing with Masonry, just replace all of his comments in the first few chapters about liberalism with Masonry, and you've got the same thing, right? So it's a plan, which Quigley does talk about. The negative idea of the nature of evil flowed from the belief that human nature was good, and this comes out of the notion of liberalism from the Enlightenment, and the belief that society, collective social orders, were somehow inherently lesser or bad. And this is how we get the notion of classical liberalism. The state is evil because it is in some way a collective grouping or metaphysical category that is arbitrary and created, and therefore as a result the solution, the source of freedom for man is individual liberty. Now, this is why I don't class myself as a libertarian or a free marketer or a anarchist or any of these Enlightenment invented ideologies, is for, number one, because they're not good philosophy, and that would be because they are grounded in the notion of the idea that you can have a dialectical tension that is the source of freedom, right? So that somehow that atomistic individualism is the way or the means out of the box of this life, the prison and the struggle, and so forth. So whereas Thomas Hobbes would have said in Leviathan that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and the state is the Leviathan, and that's the only way to go. We're all part of this big collective entity, the state. The revolutionary dialectical opposite, which is controlled opposition, is the notion of individual libertarian freedom. Oh, if the state and collectivism is bad, then I must rush to the opposite, as humans often do, creatures of extremes. Then the opposite is the truth. And this is why we're all constantly manipulated and caught in dialectics, is because we think that if that equals bad, and the people that we listen to who propagandize this tell us that collectivism, socialism are bad, then we must rush to the other end, to the freedom-loving libertarian forefathers and Jefferson and so forth. But the fathers of collectivism and the fathers of atomistic individual libertarianism were all members of the same lodges, aren't they? Now, they may have disputes and spats amongst them, but both the Eastern communism and the Western libertarian free marketers are all sons of the lodge. They're all sons of the widow, or whatever the Masonic terminology is. And they are all united in the rejection of metaphysical categories for nation, tribe, and embodied in the monarch and the church, and a sort of leveling attempt, right, where it becomes the goddess reason, right, not actually believed to be a real goddess, but the symbolic embodiment of human rationality and reason, right? And we see this today in its full flowering with transgenderism, right? Because if all external metaphysical categories, such as belonging to the human race, right, that's a collective belonging to a family, belonging to the gender of male, right? These all become tyrannies in modern, full-fledged, coming to its full conclusion liberalism. So we live in the liberal era, whether we even know it or not. We swim in its sea. We are sons and daughters of its milieu, zeitgeist, and ethos, whether we know it, acknowledge it, or even care. And so we can truly speak of the spirit of our times as, quote, liberal. But the irony, of course, is even we'll see with Quigley, is that this liberal belief is fiction. It's not true liberty. It is rather a reorganization and new business phase by which to reorganize the globe under the banner of liberty. Meanwhile, everyone is kept in abject slavery, embodied, as I said, in the final revolution of Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley, the total technocratic state. And Quigley will deal with that in a chapter. He will actually discuss that we are now moving into the age of total technocratic expert control. The experts, right? It makes me think of Alan Watt always talking about, oh, you see, the experts. Yeah, Quigley. Oh, you see, Carol Quigley told you you'd be under the rule of the experts, you see. Right, the experts. And that Quigley has a chapter on that. So Alan Watt is correct in that statement. But most of the persons who in the alternative sphere, so to call, which I hate all of that. I don't like being classed with it. They're going to tell you that the answer and the way out of all of this mess is more of 1776, right? We need more of what was the venom that started this whole problem of the modern world. And if you doubt me, right, all you libertarians and anarchists out there, just read page 24 of Quigley's book. What is the modern liberal era grounded in? Belief in the innate goodness of man, secularism, belief in progress, liberalism, capitalism, faith in science, scientism, democracy, and nationalism. These are liberal movements of yesteryear. Now, Western Civilization to 1914 will begin the first section of the book, and here what stands out is the fact that we're not going to get really deep into kind of the boring things of all the economic facts and figures. We're going to focus on sections such as page 47, where Quigley says, considering the bankers, okay, banker power, and this is what's going to characterize the modern era. The modern liberal era is Homo economicus, okay? Another very wise man, Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, another great civilization treatment, wrote that we have passed out of Western Faustian man, as he called it. This is Western man seeking, always to explore, to expand, to create civilization and so forth. And we pass out of that into the modern era of decay that Spengler titled The Dominance of the Money Power, right? Homo economicus. So out of Faustian man into Homo economicus, monetary quantitative man. And again, this is a natural corollary to the liberalism, capitalism, democracy, nationalism, scientism, secularism, and monetarism, materialism of the European shift that Quigley talks about. So naturally, that shift away from the belief in metaphysical truths and principles is what gives rise to going to Dallas or New York and seeing the tallest buildings being banks. Okay, banks are the new cathedral. The banking cathedral, right, is what defines the modern era, and Quigley talks about that. Okay, so it is a banker conspiracy. Don't ever doubt that. And so when discussing the bankers on page 47, Quigley says, moreover, their relationships with governments were always in monetary terms, not real terms. So the banker's angle was always about money with governments. Why is that? Well, because they were obsessed, he says, with the stability of monetary exchanges between one country's money system and another, and they used this power of influence to do two things. Number one, to make all money and debt expressed explicitly and strictly in terms of a single limited commodity, which they controlled, of course, gold. So prior to 1914, Western civilization was about A banker determined gold standard. Okay. And what was number 2 here quickly? 2, to get all monetary systems and matters out of control of the government into private banking hands. That is crucial because number 1, you are going to see endlessly regurgitated and repeated in the libertarian patriotard alt media Tea Party circus, the ridiculous moniker that if we could only go back to the gold standard in 1776 and blah 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 blah. Well, that's an older bankster model. Duh. It's right here in Quigley's book on page 47. And Quigley says right after that, the whole point of this was to shift commercial capitalism into mercantilism and the whole pattern of social organization around dynastic monarchy to restructure it. So the whole point of all that was restructuring society out of monarchies and an older form of commercial capitalism that would be East India Company, Hudson Bay Company, Dutch Company, Virginia Company, and so forth. These great predecessors to the modern corporation, which were at that time licensed state corporations, and shift away into private banking control of monetary systems. That was the bankers' entire strategy prior to 1914. Now, this does not just include Jewish bankers. It includes all the big banking houses and dynasties in all the countries, including Japan. All right, so persons who obsess over Jews all day, you will find Quigley's chapter on Japan very relevant, because Japan will eventually fall into the hands of a handful of Japanese bankers. Now, from here, Quigley says the period of commercial capitalism, okay, which he calls the period of 1440 to 1850. Okay, this is the monarchy stamped companies. Okay, and again, East India Company, right, Hudson Bay Company, Virginia Company. Those monarchy stamped companies are done away with. That's what the bankers want. And how and why do they do this? Well, they want control. Why? And the means by which they do this is the libertarian philosophy. It's 1776 and 1789. That's not me, okay, if you're mad out there. It's page 47 in Quigley. Okay, it's the first chapter and it's the second chapter. Now, you can think of that what you want, but that's what he says. Now, how else did they do this scam? Well, Britain, of course, will figure into this in a key role, particularly from 1770 to 1850 in the industrial capitalism period, where Britain achieved victories over Louis XIV, right, in the 1660s, and then the French Revolutionary government with Napoleon, also Britain victory there as well, 1792 to 1815, leads, of course, to the predominance of the British Empire, the Anglo-American establishment. Now, the Anglo-American establishment, the earlier form, right, the British Empire, this is not a empire, as we said, of the people. Okay? It's a shadow banking empire. And more or less, Quigley will say that, right? Because he just talked about how the bankers wanted to get the monarchs in their pocket. And that's what they did. Get them in debt. Run the countries up debt-wise. Get those monarchs into your pocket. And then the monarchs become your puppets. You can get them to do what you want because they owe you billions of dollars, okay? And wars help that, right? So we all know about these stories of the Rothschilds and Napoleon and Waterloo and so forth, right? Now, again, the whole point, run up everybody's credit. Get them in debt. And this is the old banker trick. Now, how do they do this? Well, here we go. For generations, men had sought to avoid the one drawback of gold, its heaviness, by using pieces of paper, gold notes, right, to represent the specific pieces of gold, right? Gold's heavy. We're going to use gold as a currency. Well, we might as well have pieces of paper to represent the gold, because then it's not, you're not lugging around 600 pounds worth of gold to buy your groceries. Now, today we call these gold certificates, he says, but such a certificate entitles the bearer to exchange it for a piece of gold on demand. But in view of the convenience of paper, only a small fraction of certificate holders ever did make such demands, right? So very few people actually went and claimed their gold with a gold certificate. They left it in the bank and they used the notes. Now, what did this do? Well, this allowed the gold holders to print gold certificates, right? Accordingly, the rest of the gold could be used for business purposes, right? And so here we have at the beginning of fractional reserve banking with gold notes, gold reserved for payments and demands against them, and so forth, right? Such an excess volume of paper claims against reserves that we now call banknotes. In effect, the creation of paper claims greater than the reserves of all available means that the bankers were creating money out of nothing. Fiat, beginning of the idea of fiat currency in the modern era. The same could be said in another way, that by issuing banknotes, the same could be done in another way, he says, not by banknotes, but by deposit banks. Deposit banks discovered that orders and checks drawn against deposits and given to third persons were often not cashed. So if they weren't cashed, it's just sitting there, and you can kind of do what you want with this gold, right? Well, then print up gold certificates. Accordingly, it was necessary for the banker to keep on hand in actual money no more than the fraction of the deposits that were likely to be drawn upon and cashed in. So if you have $1 billion in gold, or so let's say you got $1 million in gold, and every year only $1,000 worth of that is actually cashed, you can do what you want with all of this extra gold and make up gold certificates. So this created deposits and gave the appearance of value when there was nothing actually backing up the value except for the original amount of gold, right? But you could say, well, I've got $1 billion worth of bank gold notes, right? When you only had $1 million worth of gold in the bank, and you could get away with this because only a fraction of that people are actually going to claim their gold. And in England in 1694, the Bank of England, William Patterson said about the charter of the Bank of England, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of thin air." So there you go. Even in 1694, this trick was being used through the Bank of England. And of course, the Bank of England was centrally prominent in this era. And again, this is not the bank of the government of England. This is the bank of private families that own the shares and the stocks in the Bank of England, which the people of England think is the bank of the people of England. Now, the nature of business and globalism and empire and so forth is such that these bankers, and by extension their corporate buddies, want to be international. You don't want to just be a local businessman. You want to be Globocorp. You want to be Globobank. And so this impetus for globalism is what would propel the great banking dynasties that Quigley lists, right, behind the Bank of England and others, as the Rothschilds. Right, now this is page 51. So there you go. Now, so we've seen then that this banker scam is very real. It's this trick that we've heard talked about in alternative media, for so long. And we might think of, say, Ron Paul talking about the Federal Reserve and all this private establishment banking in the hands of the money printers and them running up debts and so forth through fiat currency. Now, all that's true. The only problem is that Ron Paul's answer in philosophy, for example, is a banker philosophy. It's the older banker philosophy, which Quigley says in chapter 1 and 2. So if you take issue with that, that's fine. That's your issue. I'm telling you what the establishment itself knows and says about its own philosophies and plans and strategies, and which ones worked and didn't work. So when you're trying to say, we need more 1776 to solve 1984, 1776 was beta 1984. Okay, 1984 is 2.0, and now we're moving beyond 1984. So you're not going to solve modern problems with the very thing that started the modern era. And again, this is all in Quigley, so stop being so stupid, please. Who are these big banking families of this period, right? The late 1800s and into the early 1900s. They are Bering, Lazard, Erlinger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, Speyer, Mirabaud, Mallet, Gould, Rothschild, Morgan. All of those are Anglo and Jewish, okay? And that's the power structure behind, that's the real shadow government of the Atlanticist Anglo-American establishment. So it's not all Jewish. It's not all Nazi. It's not all one thing. It's all of these banking houses that are mega rich. And they're not all Jewish, but they're also not all Calvinist or Protestant or Catholic, right? It's a combo of them all. And you can do with that what you want, but that's the truth, okay? Now, he says these banking houses were cosmopolitan and international. Okay, now this is why we get all the internationalist movements in the modern era. Okay, international communism, international capitalism. It's because the bankers behind it are internationalists, right, for their interests. And that begins to key you into the fraud nature of Marxism, because Marxism is international. It shares all of the same plans, goals, and strategies of the capitalists. It just differs on the road by which you get to the same end goal. Right? We're all on the bus to hell, but are we going to take the left fork in the road or the right fork in the road? Oh, well, it doesn't matter, because both forks in the road end up in the pits of hell. So there you go. Now, sometimes the Marxist path down the road is a quicker and better route to hell and banker control. Sometimes capital, it just depends, right? I mean, some countries, the strategy of introducing Marxism works better, right? That's where the bankers foisted Marxism upon Russia. Some places, a top-down monarch like Jordan or Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, that works better, right, to getting to the end goal. Sometimes, quote, democracy works better, right? It just depends. And it doesn't matter which one of these phony baloney systems you institute. They're all at the behest of the same banker strategy. So here's Quigley. Quigley tells you all this on page 52 and 53. And it's all a scam that's practiced principally through the banking and central banking monetary system, which is not public, it is private. So the libertarians that tell you that the problem is that the banking establishment is public and not private are lying to you, or they're telling you half the story. Right now, the Federal Reserve does have this air of being governmental because it's under the Treasury Department, but the money in the stock, the stock, the controlling interests are owned by private families. And it's always been that way. And you're going to see that pattern in Tragedy and Hope, where Quigley's going to show you that through the money supply, controlling the money supply, through inflation, through printing, through fiat currency, this is how they've always been able to wreck economies, regulate, steer, create a boom as well, through the money system. And it really is that simple. Now, the scams can get very complex, and we can get buried and lost in mountains of banking regulations and complexities and all this and so forth. But it's very simple, and that's essentially Quigley's point, is telling you that it's just the same basic scam that is varied and multiplies in different places at different times. And as we're going to see, it's going to, in the modern era, especially after World War II, fall under the aegis of the Bank for International Settlements, right? The central bank of central banks, as it's known, as it's called. So, as we said here, kind of in this intro talk, we're not going to waste time speculating about conspiracy theories about Quigley's own life and Quigley's book and it being suppressed and all this kind of stuff. It's a waste of time. You're never gonna determine any of that anyway. Why don't we just dive into the book and see what he says? Okay, that's a much better use of our time than wasting time speculating about it. And this always comes up, right? Like if you talk about Quigley, people come on your blog and they comment, they put these long, sprawling tomes of them telling you what really went on with the Quigleys and the plates that were going to be used to print Treasure and Hope. Who cares, dude? Then you're not going to figure any of that out. I just wanted to see what's in the book. Okay, so this thing's 1,300 pages, so let's get into it because we're never going to get to the bottom of which conspiracy theory about Quigley's life is true. Now, one of the first things I noticed as I was reading was this chapter 3 is about Russia, and it is a very bad propaganda chapter about Russia. This is the first thing that clues you into the fact that, wait a minute, now Quigley's got an agenda here. Okay, now he's obvious. He's ultimately going to be very open about his agenda and so forth, but when you begin the book and you're reading the Russia chapter, you're like, whoa, dude. Especially if you know Russian history to some degree, or if you know the history of the Orthodox Church or the East and Christianity, medieval Christianity, be it Byzantium or the Roman Empire, you know that Quigley's not honest here. Okay, he's written a propaganda chapter, and what's it about? Well, to basically say Russian civilization, which he does talk about, the Russian Empire, right, up to 1917. Oh, they're all backwards, and they're dumb, and they just don't get it, and they're savage, and Western civilization is so great. Right? We're progressive and liberal and secular, and see, those Russians are all so backwards. Right? They believe in the church and Orthodox theology. Oh, give me a break, right? I mean, come on, man. We know that secularism and scientism is where it's at. And that's what he does, right? So beginning on chapter 3, page 81. Oh, Byzantium is just the worst thing ever. Russians. Oh, it's Dark Ages. It's just, they're all just backwoods, and they don't know their butt from a hole in the ground. But the West, of course, does. And ironically, this is right after he's just talked about how the New Freedom Initiative of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 was a bunch of banker scams, right? For getting the U.S. into the war, right? World War One, and how the bankers were pretty much behind Woodrow Wilson and the passing of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, and again, this is all. So, in other words, for Quigley, admittedly, being liberal and progressive is being a slave to a bunch of banking scams and guys running your central banking system scamming you. That's progressive and liberal. But a Russian empire, that's Dark Ages. So now it doesn't matter whatever you think of Russian empire. Okay, but what I'm saying, do you see how this is propaganda, right? Why do I need what is this, 80, 100, no, 40 pages, 50, why do I need 50 pages telling me how bad Russia is, right? Well, it's because Quigley is writing for the Western establishment, and he's writing concerning the Great Game, which he talks about, and this is the long battle between the British Empire and Russia for global strategic dominance, particularly when we think of the heartland theory of Halford Mackinder and so forth, versus the Eastern different philosophy of the world, right? From Russia, it's different, and from Eurasia. And Dugan points this out in one of his talks very well, that basically what Quigley exemplifies here is just a supremely Eurocentric perspective, right? And by extension, America is Eurocentric as well, right? Just this idea that because we're in the West and because we have, quote, democracy, that this gives us some sort of legitimacy and superiority, some moral superiority to voice this everywhere in the world, and to consider everything else dark ages. Well, no, I'm sorry, but the Enlightenment, scientism, scientific revolution, these are scams from more wicked, nefarious scamsters, okay? So whatever evils are going on in Russia and so forth, the Western establishment is run by total viper bankers who are 10 times worse. That's the point. And that is the hypocrisy of Quigley, especially in this Russian Empire chapter, right? Pages 90 to 110, 105, right? And Quigley's going to talk about the Russian ethos, Russian nationalism, and by extension Russian imperialism, and the philosophy of Russia and how it's grounded in Orthodox theology. It's an extension of Byzantium from Saints Cyril and Methodius, right? He will talk about different Russian philosophers and their impact, different Russian rulers, and then the Slavic mind itself, right, as well as, I guess you could say, Eurasia by extension, China and so forth. But really, he's got to hone in and talk about how bad Russia is, right? And so pretty much everything bad is located from the east, from Russia. Socialism and communism and Marxism, those are bad because they're in Russia. Oh, but by the way, Quigley, aren't you actually going to talk about the fact that the revolutions are funded by the bankers? Well, he does. Yet the Russians are still bad for the socialism and the communism. But it was foisted by the bankers. So, come on here, right? Stop contradicting yourself and be consistent. So yeah, this is really a propaganda hit piece on Russia, and I mean it's just it's bad, right? Because he tries to talk about Jesus, and in this retarded section, the idea that Russia is supposed to be Christian but doesn't follow Jesus, as if the West and bankers followed. Jesus went into the temple and cleansed it of bankers. So come on, Quigley, right? And here on page 102, 103, he's trying to talk about Russian Orthodox theology, which he has absolutely no understanding of. He has no clue. He's a bat in a blind bat and flying towards the sun. I mean, he just has no idea what's going on. And he's one of the worst things he does is try to talk about philosophy and theology, because he's just has no clue what he's talking about when he talks about these things. So he tries to talk about Christian heresies and Neoplatonism, and these actually constitute some of the worst parts of the book. So he has no idea what he's talking about when he tries to explain the Greek, Byzantine, Russian civilization. And he ends it by saying that mystical Slav imperialism is apocalyptic and it's going to destroy the world, and the real danger is that because Russia sees itself as the third Rome, right? And this is just the worst thing ever. And so the third Rome idea, he says, is what merged with Lenin and Marxism to provide the ideology of Soviet Russia after 1917. Well, that's kind of true, except that it's not that Russia is just not the villain of the world. If anything, Russia constitutes, I would say, a large hope for the world. And it is the Western Atlanticists who are basically telling little boys and girls to cut off their genitalia and become genderless goblins. Okay, that's the real villains. Right now, Quigley, you are a hypocrite because you should have seen and should know. If would you still be saying this, Quigley? Right? If you saw where Western liberalism was today, that it would be wrecking children. Russia is not wrecking children globally. The Western banking establishment and Atlanticists are. So Quigley, you've got to rethink and repent, and you've got to you really need to answer for your, on the one hand, description of the bankers as these scamsters who control governments, and then turn around and talk about all the countries that the bankers target, right, to destroy as the bad guys. What hypocrisy. Amazing hypocrisy, actually. Phenomenal. Especially when on page 63 you talk about international financial practices and the ability of the bankers to even co-opt the U.S., right, and bring the U.S. into all of these foreign conflicts, which the Founding Fathers, not that I'm even interested in the Founding Fathers, I don't care for the Founding Fathers, but they at least talked about not being involved in foreign entanglements and expansionism and so forth. But no, Quigley, you will talk about it and in total hypocrisy turn around and talk about Russia as the enemy when it's the Western bankers who sought to wreck Russia through Marxism and Leninism and so forth. And of course this and your very infantile understanding of Byzantium orthodoxy and philosophy, I think, is very telling as well. You're a military historian, but you're going to talk about theology? Give me a break. You don't even know what the apocalypse is. So I'm not going to pay much attention to Quigley trying to talk about Russian theology and the Cathari and the Gnostics. Right? So this is traversing into fields in which he has no clue. Now that's going to be, I think, a good place to kind of conclude the free section of hour one, beginning in Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. And so we've kind of seen how he set the stage with the idea of the banksters seeking libertarian philosophy to free the monetary policies of countries from the state so that it can be put into private hands, and then through the private banking establishment behind a shadow facade of a public banking institution, they can then control nation states. And that is all admitted, and that was the logical stage, the necessary progression from the presuppositions of the European shift, which Quigley calls the Enlightenment period, of the secularism, the nationalism, the capitalism, private banking, liberalism, and so forth. And then we saw how this required from him in his propaganda section a virulent anti-Russian treatise chapter that grounds this all in the great game and has no understanding of theology, of course. So, but what do you expect from this guy? And what we're going to see in the next section is how this then will lead to the new power structure. I don't guess you'd call it new, but the main players, the power structure of this period, right? 20th century, end of the 19th and into the 20th century. And this will be the Cecil Rhodes, Milner, Rothschilds, and the Round Table Group. And from there, Royal Society, Royal Institute for International Affairs, and so forth. And this is the power block of the West. This is the center of power of the Atlanticist Anglo-American banking establishment. And we're going to see how from there, that's going to propel the rest of the century, right? The entire 20th century will be played out on a chessboard, the grand chessboard that Brzezinski will talk about, from the vantage point of this Cliveden and Set Milner roundtable banking families, basically moving the chess pieces of Europe and the globe